I am happy to welcome you to our plenary for Sunday about COVID relief. There's really no greater moment than right now to be thinking about how we can organize power during this very terrifying time in a crisis of capitalism. And I'm very happy to introduce you guys to some very incredible organizers from across the country. My name is Soleil Smith, and I was previously the co-chair and co-founder of the Knox College YDSA. Our chapter is about 3 years old now, which makes me very happy. And we are going to just take some time to talk about different ways that we can build power and just kind of understand what we're up against, So I just want to go around really quick and have our panelists introduce themselves and what kind of work they've been doing in regards to COVID-19 relief.
Okay, so I'll go first. My name is Farah Sufra Forrest. I am currently the State Assembly woman for District 57, representing parts in Brooklyn. And before that, I was I still am, a registered nurse where during COVID-19, I worked as a maternal child health nurse, visiting patients in their home. No matter what they were, I was there. And then also later on transitioning to be a nurse manager at a federally qualified health center. So that was what I was doing during COVID. And I'll pass it on. To Rebecca.
Go ahead, Rebecca.
Okay, thank you. All right, good morning, everyone. Rebecca Gorelli. I'm a science and STEM educator in Arizona, also strike leader with the Red for Ed movement, Arizona Educators United, and organizer with National Educators United, which is a group of Educator United groups from across the nation that got together to work on a project, basically to more help each other organize more effectively. I'm also Phoenix DSA and on the steering committee of the Democratic Socialist Labor Commission and working on the subcommittee with the Educator and School Staff Network now. We just launched the campaign last Saturday. So exciting work, happy to be here, and thank you. And I'll hand it off.
Hi, everyone. My name is Greg Gonzalez. I'm an epidemiologist at the Yale School of Public Health. But my organizing activity really started in the AIDS epidemic with ACT UP Boston and ACT UP New York. And when the pandemic hit, I returned to my roots and felt like it was more important to sort of address the sort of insanity of last year's COVID response, from the misinformation coming out of the White House to the sort of shoddiness of our national response. Now in 2021, I've been more focused on a couple of big issues. One is vaccine equity in the United States, to ensure that everybody who needs a vaccine gets it, and global vaccine equity, because while we're all talking about being able to vaccinate Americans by midsummer, most people around the world won't get a vaccine for 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, thank you all. Thank you all for introducing yourselves. Like I said, we've got some incredible people that are going to talk with us today. But I think, Greg, you provide a really good segue to our first question, which is about, one of the clearest issues with the COVID-19 pandemic is how stark everyone's experiences have been along racial and class lines. We've seen, like, in my current city of Chicago, like, most of the people who've been vaccinated are, white, upper middle class individuals and not many of the Black and brown community members that we have in the city. And so I was wondering if you all could speak to what racial and economic disparities you've seen in our healthcare system during this pandemic.
who do you want to go first?
Let's have you go first, Greg.
So, look, in March of 2020, I wrote a piece for the Boston Review called Alone Against the Virus. And, a year ago, we were writing about how the roots of what was happening in the United States were tied to the country's legacy of white supremacy and neoliberalism, in the fact that people have been disposable for most of the US history, depending on the color of their skin. COVID just replicates longstanding inequalities in healthcare that we've seen since the founding of our country. In addition, in that piece, we talked about how sort of neoliberalism and the sort of surrender of healthcare to the market, the sort of devaluation of public health, all in prologue to what happened in 2020, set us up for the great fall that we saw. So COVID just exposed what was already there. The legacy of white supremacy, neoliberalism in the US. Getting out of COVID is not about a vaccine, but it's confronting capitalism and confronting white supremacy, because otherwise we're just setting us up for the next pandemic, the next climate crisis, or the next catastrophe.
As a nurse, I can talk about the access that people had before COVID-19. If you sometimes think about your insurance card, you kind of think about it, your passport to health, right? You're sick, you present your passport, you fly wherever you need to go to get wherever care you need to go. But being that, when I look at where people are able to go fly with their insurance card that's like Medicaid, or maybe it's the $20 essential plan that New York offers, you couldn't go far. And that means that the options for your health to really be addressed wasn't going far either. And so even in Brooklyn, I worked at a public health, the public health hospital in Brooklyn, and where they were prioritizing surgeries, major invasive procedures over primary care, like diabetic clinic. And so when you have a population that majority, a lot of people are coming in for high blood pressure, coming in for diabetes, and they're not getting that preliminary help, that preliminary step to good diet, how to take your medicine correctly, and then you expose them to a virus, that takes advantage of any comorbidity, asthma, diabetes, hypertension, and then blows it up in your face. Here you go. It was just a setup for disaster. And this has been a setup for a very long time. It's particularly people in the Black and brown communities, but also it's a class issue too, because, anyone that had low income insurance felt it, again, that is Black and brown communities, but it was felt upstate New York too, where we have communities that were white that were not getting the services that they needed.
Yeah, I think you guys. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Rebecca.
No, I wasn't sure if you wanted me to respond to healthcare, since that's not my sector, but I'm good.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, I think you guys really speak to some very important things that have been going on, especially, across the state. We're seeing some very similar breakdowns in like how our healthcare has been accessible. And I think that, again, one of the ways we've been seeing it take place in Illinois has been like your access to healthcare, not just like with, like you said, Farah, like the passport of your healthcare with having insurance, but a lot of access to, COVID-19 testing, and even the vaccine now is dependent upon like whether or not you have access to the internet. Like it's not communicated where you can get these vaccines and where you can get these testing unless you have those kinds of resources where people are actually trying to bridge that gap. And that's just making these situations of disproportionate deaths in Latinx and Black communities even worse. I was wondering, I want to pry a little more with you, Farah and Greg, about your experiences a little more. Greg, could you speak to perhaps like some similarities between this current moment and your experience during the ACT UP time of like fighting against the AIDS epidemic from the Reagan administration, which was really trying its hardest to enact essentially genocide against our queer brothers and sisters?
So the AIDS epidemic was a dress rehearsal for what we're seeing today. Larry Kramer, who was one of the founders of ACT UP, I can't remember where he did it, but he talked about how the U.S. thought of all of us as disposable people, not just queer people, Black and brown people, people who use drugs, sex workers, immigrants. And we had to fight for our right to stay alive. There were no policies to protect us. There were no programs to protect us. There was no Affordable Care Act to provide insurance to us. We had to fight for everything we got in the midst of an administration that didn't want to hear anything about HIV. Reagan didn't say the word HIV. He didn't mention the AIDS epidemic until almost at the end of his second term. And so a movement arose, which was cross-racial, cross-class, cross-gender, to sort of fight for a whole bunch of things, from needle exchange to safer sex, to insurance programs like the Ryan White Care Act, which provides care and services to many, many people around the country, to legislation that protected our rights to keep us free from discrimination. And so this was all done by a small group of highly motivated people. I think ACT UP, interesting thing about ACT UP, it was not a mass movement in the sense of its forebearers in the civil rights and the women's movement. It was a bunch of very, very determined people across the country and across the world to sort of fight for our rights. Fast forward to now, we're seeing another administration, at least in the beginning of the epidemic, that thought large portions of the US were disposable. In a certain sense, for former President Trump, everybody except his immediate circle of supporters was disposable, and sort of amped up. I mean, if you thought the AIDS epidemic and the Reagan administration's response to it was bad, it was unimaginable what we saw last year. It was beyond incompetence. It was malign. It was vicious. It was pre-planned, and 500,000 people are dead. 500,000 people are dead in the U.S. The Lancet Commission put out a report a couple of weeks ago saying that 40% of the deaths could have been avoided in the United States, perhaps more. I mean, we're not out of the woods yet, right? The legacy of last year is still with us with the vaccine rollout. There was no plan on January 20th to deliver vaccines, and everybody's scurrying around to get that done. And meanwhile, you have these fucking Republicans in Congress trying to beat back the COVID relief bill, because they're saying it's a handout to the left. When you look through the bill, it's really everything we need: vaccine relief, support for states and localities, direct payments to families. I mean, so the Republican Party is just hell bent on killing us. I mean, I really do think that's the case, because we need more relief than $1.9 trillion right now. It's really incumbent upon us to gather together as a nation if we're going to beat this pandemic. And playing austerity politics with us right now is really bad news.
Absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. I think that no one is hiding like their true selves right now. I think our government, and especially like the Republican Party, but also the Democrats, are really, demonstrating that they are not concerned with how any of us get by in this moment. And it's really, we're really just meant to fend for ourselves, which is why it's important that we organize in this moment. I would love to hear, Farah, more about your previous experiences in the medical field and what buildup you've seen to this current crisis that we're facing. What failures in our healthcare system beyond just insurance, or more like going more into that, that have brought us to this point?
Well, I can give you a story of a patient. So I primary worked in primary care. So that first step, that preventative care. And so one of my earlier patients came in to me stressed out and like anxious about the status of her pregnancy test. Like it was like, usually people are excited or whatever, but she was just like nervous, right? And I was like, okay, well, I'm talking to her, coaching her through. But what she didn't understand is that now this could be a cost to her, right? She was undocumented at the time, and that she really felt, vulnerable. Not only vulnerable in the sense of the threat of a medical bill, but then also not being able to work, being in a relationship with someone where now you're perceived as a cost burden. Let's talk about it. Domestic violence is not just beat you upside the head. It's also manipulation of your finances, manipulations of your emotions, which is something we also, as nurses, we're very intimate with. We understand that. And then not having a job, your housing, right? And, I'm talking to her about her immigration status, and I was able to connect her to where she needed to go. Thank God, because at the time, I had the time to sit with her. But usually with patients in a public health system where you're seeing 100 patients a day coming through the door, you don't have that time to address each individual patient. So I had left that hospital and I went into community care. So I'm actually in the people's homes. And I noticed, oh my God, here's the patient again. This time she delivered a baby. And I'm visiting the baby in the home because now she's unable to control her hypertension. And it's the same thing again. Before it was pregnancy, now it's hypertension, and it's around the same situations. Insecurity, feeling insecure about everything in your life, from your health to to the economics, to your housing, to the status of your relationship, everything. And when I walked into this woman's home, I understood. You got 3 kids in a studio apartment, and you don't know how you're gonna make ends meet. And so when when I approach health, I think of it as a holistic thing. So in addition to being a nurse, I'm also a tenant activist, right? And one of the projects that I did early in my years was lead-based poisoning. And it's interesting how the efforts that I did at that age, at a young age, to educate people on lead-based poisoning affects us even today, because we know that lead-based poisoning under age 5 affects your intellectual capabilities. So everything is connected, As a child health nurse, I'm looking at lead levels in the mother to prevent problems later on in the future. All of this is part of health. And if we cut down health, when we have a governor that's proposing 20% cuts or this percent cuts to public health, it really severely hampers the connection people have to overall uplifting themselves. Because we know if your body's right, your mind's right, then you're able to actually be right in life. But it's been a roller coaster. It's actually one of the main reasons why I ran for office. So to speak to what Greg talked about, we're actually looking at PrEP to be offered under insurance, to make sure that it's covered by insurance, because we know that PrEP is usually, if you don't pay, if somebody's not paying it for you, then usually you have to pay out of pocket. And so it becomes, to not get HIV becomes kind of like a rich person's thing. But when you have insurance, you're able to access that and that protection, or at least that feeling of security, right? Because that's the idea of insecurity, right? The security that I can take every option, everything available to make myself safe, keep me safe and my family safe. So.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing that experience about your patient. I think we've absolutely seen like these intersections between all sorts of different compounding oppressions that we experience in our society. I think, tantamount among those being a lot of environmental harms that we've seen in our communities, like in Los Angeles or in Chicago or, any major city, you have oftentimes like with that people who are living, often Black and brown community members living in areas where there's a lot of industry going on that's very pollutive and very harmful to like all life. And then you see, increases in asthma, increases in all sorts of different respiratory illnesses, rare forms of cancer. And that has brought us to this point now where so many people are experiencing these things they wouldn't normally, and now also have to deal with COVID-19 and deal with, like you said, like the insecurities of already getting those things treated and being able to go somewhere where you have a doctor that you can trust to take care of you, and then also deal with, on top of that, COVID-19. Yeah, I think that's a really great point. Thank you for saying that, Farah. And also, Greg, I think that leads us well to our next question. So knowing all of this stuff that we have, all these different intersecting oppressions, we have seen eviction moratoriums end. Like in New York, we have seen renters' rights slowly be eroded that were given last year. We have seen just a continuous rise in healthcare disparities. And now we're also seeing like a lot of disparities in education and what kinds of education is offered, either leaning really hard into in-person learning and preventing, virtual learning to be productive for a lot of students who are often Black and brown students. And so I was wondering if you guys could speak to how this pandemic has also shown us the importance of having different safety nets in place. And I think I want to use safety nets as a broad term. I think that that can mean things like different forms of welfare from the government, but I also think it can mean things like mutual aid programs. I think it can also mean tenants organizations or like unions. And I want to throw that question to Rebecca first.
Well, I think when we think of safety nets for our students, in all the communities, all of our communities are in red right now, right? According to the maps. And throughout this past, since last March, when obviously we all started organizing the Only When It's Safe campaigns, and our first campaign was to close schools down initially, and then, it's evolved ever since. What we have seen is mutual aid pop up here in Phoenix and obviously across the nation. But what that means for our students, and I can't tell you how many stories and how many educators have been helping their students with eviction moratoriums, with getting the funds they need to actually have housing. In Arizona, we have the lowest unemployment in the nation. I think we might be second to last in the nation. I don't remember what it is specifically, but it's very low. And so even if we have students whose parents are in unemployment, it's not enough to even come close to covering bills. And so there's this real need. There's all these traumatic factors of having no housing, no money. Obviously, access to healthcare is a major thing, right? There's a lot of multi-generational families that, I taught in West Phoenix in the highest refugee population in the city. It's a beautiful, beautiful district where we have family resource centers where they can come, kind of like a community school sort of effort. come and get everything they need from services, translation, food, bus cards, clothing, backpacks, supplies for school, that sort of thing. And like the need for that was there pre-COVID. And now, as everyone has already mentioned, it has really exacerbated and really blown it out to the public to show like our schools are really the heart of the communities. We provide those social safety nets and everything we do. You see that we provide millions of meals. We provide the mental health, counselors, social workers, all of those parts and pieces, bus cards, clothing, access to understanding nutrition. Parents can go to classes and things like that to understand things, navigating immigration policy. All of these things are built within our school system, and especially more in urban progressive districts here, like in West Phoenix, where we provide all those things to the community. And so the safety net was there before, and now it's even more needed in this light of the COVID crisis. And really the mutual aid that popped up all around the city, all around even out here in the suburbs where I live is just incredible, because that's where people are, one, going for information, right? There's these now community hubs, even just social media, Facebook pages, but groups that are doing the work in person to get people what they need. And whether that's, understanding how to access a COVID test, providing for understanding how do I even file unemployment if I don't have a computer, if I don't, speak English, all these barriers that help people get the tools that do exist, even though those tools are not good enough, not adequate whatsoever. So it's like this super broad, it's everything, as you guys mentioned, it's all interconnected. But the beauty of what schools do, and I'm not saying this should be on our shoulders. We know this as educators, we cannot solve every problem that comes across the table, but then we get blamed for it. It's always our fault. And so how do we really, work in our communities to build these relationships, to help raise awareness that schools are the hearts of the community? We provide these services. And if people actually really cared about the mental health of students with this whole, forcing back to in-person instruction, which is, compounded by this narrative of student mental health. Well, if you all actually cared about student mental health, you would fund counselors 100%, which we haven't done. All we do is austerity politics and defund. And which is also connected to police-free schools. Why don't we take those resources and invest in our communities in the actual services they need? So from an educator perspective, this is a massive topic with social safety nets, but it comes down to the point that our schools are the hearts of the community. We are the cornerstone of those communities, and we have been underfunded for decades. So when this crisis comes, we are doing the best we can, but we don't have the resources we need to do any of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, with both activism that's been taking place, like with unions trying to push back against this very dangerous and like haphazard reopening that's like going on across the country, both like, I think we've seen a lot of that pushback in the West. I think we've seen it in New York, and most recently we've seen it like with the Chicago Teachers Union. There's like this very strange narrative that's being peddled of like, the mayor and like, the powers that be are the only ones who are actually concerned with the health and like mental health and wellness of our students. And the only way to do that is like, to make them deal with the pandemic in an even more alarming way without any more resources. And that's just plain wrong. Farah, could you talk more about, you can either speak to the social safety net again, like in terms of healthcare and how that plays out in terms of like maybe Medicare for all or a more universal plan like that, or in terms of like also your tenants organizing.
Okay. To also speak on Rebecca's piece about what schools actually provide, I was also a school nurse. I had so many jobs. I was also a school nurse. And so one of the things that I worked in was in special needs schools, where our jobs was to provide healthcare, like actually medicine for students during the day in school. So for those parents that now had to take care of their child at home, they're not sending private nurses home. They're not sending more home health aides. So if a child was on a peg tube feeding through their tube, now the parent has to take that on. And so either she, or, it mostly falls on the she because it's the mother. She either has to stay home from work to take care of the baby, or she has to hire somebody else to come to the home. And then that means that $400 check, at least ain't no nurse coming to your house for $100, okay? You're at least taking $200 out of your money for someone to take care of your child. So that's one thing I wanted to speak to that, to the point that Rebecca, the importance of school, how deep it goes. As far as safety nets, one of the biggest things that stuck to me is two things. One, when back in 2011-10, the state was doing rethinking Medicaid, right? Rethinking our health system, rethinking how much we're putting in. There was a report that was put out that that the state currently has X amount of ventilators, I believe about 11,000 of ventilators, and that we were short. That if should something happen, even in the best case scenario, we would not be prepared. And when the Medicaid redesign team at the time, along with the governor and all the big heads, got together and read this report, they then decided to make cuts into our healthcare. Rather than prepare for later, prepare for, to be honest, especially in a city with 8 million people like New York City, some of these things are health crisis inevitable. I think so. And that we should be always on the alert to be prepared and to address it. But instead of being prepared, they decided to do cuts. I think that when we look at now, currently, what's going on with the nursing homes, what's going on, the scandal with the nursing home and the unreported deaths, allowing 9,000 nursing home patients to enter a system that was already at its brink. It's at its brink that there was no nursing ratios. The reimbursement was funky for nursing homes. You simply did not have the proper programming, the staff to train to deal with the different populations that's coming in through the nursing home. And now you realize that 50% of the deaths that were occurring were actually unreported. It's a blow. It's a revealing that this thing that we call safety net is nothing. We actually don't have a safety net. There's nothing there. Another take that I see, is the libraries, right? One of the things that I sit on this. I'm not on the committee, but it's something I care about, because I was one of those kids that would sit outside of the library or sit inside the library just to use the Wi-Fi, to use the computer, because I didn't have a computer at home. And so now when you have no computer, no library, and then you wonder why kids are falling behind, it's because there was a bare little minimum and now it's gone. And then you hear that cuts to library, cuts to public health, cuts to, or even just something as simple as the interview to get to SNAP. I had to talk to Republicans about that interview process, or if we want restaurants to be offered to SNAP recipients. And I had one Republican tell me, oh yeah, well, they're gonna use it to have alcohol. Honey, I was on SNAP, okay? Never are you ever going to have access to alcohol. But you could say that because you never been on SNAP. You never been on EB. You never been on food assistance. So you could sit there and say stupid things like that. But when we talk about the safety net, it's just, And even to this day, we have some people hacking away at it, just hacking away at it. It's ridiculousness. It's ridiculous and disappointing. And we really need to hold accountable the people who are in charge of this, really.
I mean, it's important to say that, the U.S. has never made a commitment to social welfare. Everybody likes to talk about the New Deal, but the New Deal basically excluded Black and brown people. And then, roll up to the 1990s where Bill Clinton is saying we're going to end welfare as we know it, and the era of big government is over, right? And so we've never had a commitment to social welfare in this country. Betsy Bradley, who's the president of Vassar College, wrote a book called The American Healthcare American Healthcare Paradox. And she looked at the fact that we have life expectancy that's if you rank countries that are our peer nations, equal in wealth, or nearly, we're down like in the 20s and 30s in terms of life expectancy. And it wasn't how much we spend on healthcare, it's how much we spend on social welfare, right? And so as the pandemic hit, we didn't have the social safety net to catch people when they fell. Other countries with larger social welfare states, Denmark, Scandinavian countries, and even many of the European countries were able to mitigate a lot of the economic and social crises that Americans face and still face in the context of this pandemic. And so we're going to need to figure out how to sort of build back some sort of movement to not just for Medicaid for all, but the Medicare for all, but to really build a social welfare safety net that can protect us, and that we all are our brothers and sisters keepers. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I think that you've all really pointed out like the very true fact that there is really only a social safety net in this country for the wealthy and for those that enforce like all of the different forms of like repression that we face in this country, right? Like there has still continued to be like exorbitant amounts of money for the different police forces around the country. Even with CARES Act funding, a lot of that money just ends up going to the police and never the schools or to healthcare systems, never to any resources for mental health or healthcare more broadly, never for like libraries, like you were saying, or even things like new like desires for, universal internet access across the country for, now all of these students and different workers who have to now do what's expected of them, but at home. And I think that we have also like really seen that play out on the college campus as well, in terms of how, I know at our school, when our college had decided that we would not be going back to campus, at the time they told us, it was in March, and they told us that we would go back in May because that was still the point in time where everyone thought that this would be over by the summer. They had like essentially made everyone leave campus. And at that very moment, like every single person who wasn't able to stay on campus or have a virtual job lost their job. And our school made that decision without implementing any sort of fund to help students who had lost now 3 months of wages that they were going to make. No continued mental health resources for students. No access to like transportation to get home now because you have to leave. And like we saw that in a bunch of other schools too, like, schools as big as like Ohio State were like asking students to leave over the course of like just a couple of days, or they would like, face fines and penalties for being on campus still. And that's just wrong. Like our institutions and our government, we pay into that. We pay into all of this stuff, and we are genuinely owed like any sort of like support for the money that we pay into these systems. And yet we don't get that because this is, a system made for those that are here to protect white supremacy and capitalism and not just the regular people of the world. I think that that leads us, you spoke a lot about accountability, Farah, and I think that one of the ways we do that is by building power in our communities, right? So I think that looking at both the disastrous Trump era that we saw of both pretending that COVID-19 is essentially not real, or if it is real, then it's the flu and it's fine, leading to, again, like almost 1 million people now being killed by COVID-19. No lockdowns, just leaving it up to a state-by-state recovery basis, on into the Biden presidency, where we still have not received any sort of relief checks. We still have not seen a national mask mandate, no national lockdown. But we still see that like the war machine of the United States is happy to continue operating. I want to ask you guys what ways you've built power in your communities to face up with this system, and what ways you think that some of our organizers here today can also try to do that. And I want to throw it to Greg first.
So, we were talking about mutual aid a bit, and mutual aid is about a failure of the state to provide, right? If we had social safety net, as we've been talking about, we'd need mutual aid and volunteerism to keep us healthy, well, and happy. So part of what I've been talking about with friends over the past few months and with colleagues at the SEIU and Partners in Health and others is about building a public health job corps at the grassroots, not people who have advanced degrees, but people who know their communities and who can help them not just negotiate how to get a vaccine, but as Farah said, to get access to their monthly insulin, to make sure that they get screened for breast cancer, and to build health from the ground up. And, there's some traction to this. Senator Gillibrand from New York has put a public health jobs corps into Senate legislation, put 1 million people into a path for good community health worker jobs. And we don't see these just as healthcare workers. We see them as people who are organizing on the local level to ensure that communities get what they need for health, for social and economic support. And so I think the pandemic, for all its terribleness, offers an opportunity, because the only way to get out of it is to build health from the ground up, and health broadly configured, right? Not just about pills into bodies, vaccines into arms. And so a bunch of us are trying to sort of get the Biden administration and members of Congress to take this on seriously, and that we can build jobs not just to deal with the COVID pandemic, but the climate crisis that's on our doorstep, and any sort of the myriad health disparities that have afflicted our communities for decades and decades.
To piggyback on what Greg said, healthcare is important, but then in my community, we're seeing that housing is healthcare and healthcare is housing. And so when we have a pandemic its spread is dependent on contact exposure, it is all too important to make sure that people remain in their homes, right? To shelter in place, to be able to quarantine in place if they are sick. But we find that before the pandemic, we had the issue of evictions, developments that were being put in our communities that were not affordable to community members. We also have overcrowdedness, right, in an apartment. And so when you put all these elements together and then you look at how many people were contacting COVID and then dying from COVID, it's very clear that housing has to be elevated from a luxury, because that's what it seems at this point. It's a luxury. You could always be homeless. And to put it to a point of being a human right, that this is something that should be guaranteed. When you come out the womb, you got a place to stay. And so from my experience, personal experience, when my husband got COVID-19 back in March, it was very scary for all of us because it was the four of us, my parents who were elderly with comorbidities, living in a 1-bedroom apartment. And so if somebody has COVID, like my husband, where does he stay? And so who's going to take care of him? And so that was very much a real experience for me. And thank God that, infection control was drilled inside of my head. And so we scheduled things like bathroom breaks and stuff. But I've been to patients' homes where you're having 8 people living in a 2-bedroom apartment and there is no infection control. There is no way to quarantine. And so that if one falls to COVID, all of them fall to COVID. And then you put that on top of it, the idea that now with the eviction moratorium being expired, that, now even those people, 8 people in the 2-bedroom are put at risk because now they're facing homelessness if should one of them lose a job, if should one of them, their landlord don't like their face no more and wants to evict them. And that's why we need to have the eviction moratorium. But on top of that, provide relief so that tenants can pay their rent. I'm the proponent that we should just give it to the landlords so they could leave our tenants alone and allow them to stay in their home. But then on the other side of it, putting into the charter of our state, into the Constitution, that in addition to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that housing should be is a guaranteed right as well. There are other countries that have had models of home housing, land trusts, however you want to cut it up. But this idea that not only do we have this rent regulation board controlling our destinies, right? But then also having legislators who are taking money from the real estate developers, real estate industry, not like me though, but others. We need to stop that. We need to stop that. So housing is a human right. Healthcare is housing. Drill that into your heads.
And so what I think really ties together what both of you are saying is that when we think of bargaining for the common good and developing common good demands, this is what we're talking about. And you look to Chicago Teachers Union and UTLA and others that have been successful in this right. And when we think of building for power, how do we, and I'm putting on my Arizona hat because I live in this world of organizing externally to the union, quite frankly, and hopes to push the union, right? The goal is to push the union to bargain for common good demands, to push for common good demands, things like evictions and, unemployment and healthcare and all the things that we talked about here. But like, what does that look like when you talk about building power in your communities? And the thing that I keep coming back to, because we're working on this right now in Arizona specifically, is how do we're a statewide group, and we had over 2,000 volunteers through our organizing blitz back in 2018. And that meant we had people in every county, people in every district, people in all across the state. We could track who we were with and building power in local communities, but with a common message and a common goal. And back then it was about mainly funding, but funding is tied to everything, as we all know. And so as we are working right now, and we had been building and building since last March, right? The minute COVID hit, we were hitting the ground running, saying, all right, our first task is to close these schools down and protect our communities, right? Second goal is to really claim the narrative that our schools and communities are interconnected. We are not in silos. We are not isolated from one another, and that all of our communities are interconnected because they tried to divide and conquer, right? And tried to pit school after school after school and just whatever works for this community is good, whatever works for this community, but that's not how our society works. So really smashing through that narrative and really driving home that we are interconnected. If I work in one school, I might live in another community, and there's interconnectedness. And we have to consider our grocery workers, all of our workers, we're all part of this unit. And so when we think of building power here in Arizona, one of our next goals is we are now creating a new network called the Arizona COSH Network. The Council of Occupational Safety and Health has built this network we have now with the goal of uniting unions and maybe folks who aren't plugged into a labor formation, which are groups like us, Educators United groups most of us are union members, but we're open to anybody. If you're a parent, who cares? If you're a community member, who cares? If you're non-union, if you work in a charter school, our arms are open wide, because we're building a movement here. It is broader. It is all of us interconnected. And so our next goal, thinking of all the disaster and the changing landscape, and organizing this year has been the hardest thing. And I'm sure those of you who have been in this work know this has been the hardest year ever. It is so tough. And you look at Chicago and you know it was tough. And thinking forward, though, from now until when school starts again, and for us, that's August, how do we build structures? How do we grow our network? How do we put players in place to build that base even further than we have now? And our goal is to input health and safety committees in schools, in other union workplaces. So it's a whole bunch of us from multiple unions, CWA, UFCW, teacher unions, railroad workers. And if we all can commit to working on these health and safety committees in our workplaces, teaching people how to recognize, a problem, action steps to a solution, how do we fight to win, how do we connect all these things, and broadly speaking, how does our whole community become safer with more accountability structures? And then how do we teach each other how to more effectively organize? Because this is going to be ongoing. This is not going to just end in the summer. And as educators, thinking about all the austerity we've experienced in the past 25 years, and even more so in the past decade, of how our buildings don't have adequate ventilation. CDC just told us to open a window. There are no windows in Arizona. This is the desert. We have 0 windows here. We are not even allowed to open doors because of active shooter protocols. I mean, it goes on and on and on. So when we look at building power, what can we do structurally now to catapult us towards the future? So when we have to fully go back into buildings, because right now we're not fully back. There's some full, some hybrid. It's still kind of, choppy and mixed. But what can we do so that as this, COVID continues, we have the structures in place, the people in place, the demands in place, all of these things to actually fight back collectively. That's kind of where we're at in Arizona.
Can I say something, please? If it's one thing that, I know a lot of young people are listening to this. If it's one thing I wish I could have understood from the beginning when I entered the workforce, is that 99% of us are doing the same thing, working, earning. And when we think about what that means, is that when we're taxed on what we earn. So there's a huge portion of people, there's a small portion of people who don't get taxed on what they're earned, but have unfair control, influence as to what is done in your daily lives, our daily lives. So as a working woman, right, entering this space where policy is being made, there is very few people that look like me, not just Black and brown girl, or it's about even understand the idea of what it means to clock in 9 to 5, what it means to sit and be and look at your paycheck and look at what you want in your life, and it doesn't connect. And so to me, when Rebecca talks about building power, a part of it is to understand that you cannot tell me wherever you are, that you are separate from me based on the fact that 99% of us are earning. Mm-hmm. And somehow we're not getting back what we've been putting into this society. And that's because no one else, the people who are in charge, quote unquote, in charge, are not fighting for us. And so if I could say, building on the labor unions, right? But then going back to City Hall, and at every level of government, sticking our agenda in. And when I say our agenda, the socialist agenda, the working class agenda, the idea that I have been on food stamps, but I'm here. I have sat in a library because I didn't have a computer in my house, but I'm here. And so when we collectively understand that each of one of us has to be represented in all of these levels, then things start to change. So if you went to law school, you should be a judge you should be a circuit judge. If you want to be a school trustee, get in that school trustee board. If you are not on the community board, you need to be in there telling them, hey, 99% of us is not represented in this policy, and that's a problem. And that's why I'm here, and I'm going to keep on being loud until we are represented in this problem. You understand what I'm saying? It's I see it. I'm telling you, I was the only one in that space that was able to speak on Snap and say that, no, what you're saying is lying. What you're saying is a lie. And it's also racist, and it's also classist. And he had to bite back his words. This man who never had to bite back his words, he had to bite them back because he knew someone was here listening and had a response. That's a powerful place to be. You don't have to be a state legislator. You don't have to be a state senator, but you have to be in the room. You have to be sitting at the table. You have to have a seat at the table. And if I could say that, it's fight for that seat, fight for that place at your job. You should be fighting to be shop steward. There's no reason to be sitting back complacent. Go to the union meeting. There's no excuses. Go to the PTA meeting. Because it's you. They talking about you. And if you're not in the room, hey, that's you. That's you.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I feel like you all really, like, you said it all. Like, this moment depends on all of us, and getting out of this moment in a way that doesn't end up absolutely destroying us depends on all of us. And I think with what we've seen, like in Texas, where the climate crisis and the COVID crisis are, working in lockstep, and exacerbating so many situations on top of also the capital crisis. I think that, like, we have a very small window of opportunity, but these moments of severe crisis, I think, really give us, like you all said, a good chance to revision, like, what kind of world we want and how we get there, and who we want on board with us. And who we want on board should be, like you said, Farah, like, everyone who works, the working class, like, all of us regular people who just want to live and, like, experience joy and not have to suffer under, the pressures of capitalism. I think something that makes me think about, with, like, getting involved in different community efforts and trying to build power, I think something really difficult in this moment, especially, I think a lot of people on the left have concern that, like, with Biden in office, we are going to see a significant increase in, like, complacency about what's going on because the person in charge of our country is a Democrat and not a Republican now. And I think, like, in my own workplace, which is, like, a It's like sort of a government organization, but then it's also like a social service operation kind of thing. We have seen that too. Like they've suddenly changed in the way that they feel about putting us in school. Before it was like, yeah, like Donald Trump is dealing with the pandemic in a horrible way, and like this is like atrocious. And now that Biden's in office, it's like, well, you know, like he said it's fine, and like we think it's fine, and we're all right with like making you guys go in and like potentially getting some of you killed because like, you know, our agenda is now in power, and that's great. So I'm wondering if you guys could speak to how you have helped kind of push back against complacency, and how our fellow organizers can try and undo some of those feelings. I'll pass it to Greg first.
So I remember when Bill Clinton, see, I'm older than all of you, when Bill Clinton won the White House, and I was in a hotel room with AIDS activists in DC because we had an AIDS meeting, and everybody was crying because like the Reagan-Bush era was over, and like we were overjoyed. Fast forward 2 years later, you know, we realized, you know, Bill Clinton was not a friend to us. He talked a good game, but he never did very much for AIDS during his tenure as president. In fact, you know, within a few years, he was announcing welfare reform, et cetera. Don't ask, don't tell. We can go on. The one thing it taught me is that it doesn't matter who's in power, whether it's a Republican, a Democrat, or a Democratic Socialist. Our job is not to support parties, but it's to keep people in power accountable, right? This is not about people. It's not about parties. This is about having a seat at the table, as Farah said, to make sure that when decisions are made, they're the right ones and the ones that our communities need. You know, it's also easy when you get to the table, and a lot of people I know have headed to the Biden administration to do very important jobs. But the point is, you got to know you got to remember where you came from. You know, once you're sitting at the table, you've got in the room, you have to remember where you came from. And it's very hard to sort of keep that focus when the swirl of power is all around you, when you go into the system and you're already in that. But look, you know, the right wing, since the Goldwater defeat in the 60s, has been doing what Farah said, organizing its school boards, city councils, state legislatures, governorships. You know, the point is we got to play the long game. The American right has played the long game spectacularly successfully over the past almost 60 years. And so we've got to beat them at their own game. We know how to do this. We know how to do it better than they do. We just got to sort of keep our eye on the prize.
Greg, I just want to say I was sitting in conference. I can talk about it because it's in past. And you know, one of the things that the Democrats are saying, well, they knock on doors and they give out food and they're winning. Why? And I'm like, well, that's how I won. So maybe whatever the Republicans are doing, you need to learn to do it better. So I'll tell you, as someone who went up against an incumbent, I won because I knocked on doors. I picked up the phone. I made sure I was in people's faces. And this is how we win. And this is how we connect people to the movement, by bringing the movement right into the campaign and right into the halls of legislation. And so they're sitting there like, oh, and I'm like, yeah, that's why you need to watch your seat. So you keep it up. You don't want to play these games, these organizing games, then go ahead, sit there and see how long you can sit there and be pretty. And so the other part of it is once you get that seat at the table, talk about real issues that actually bring meaning to what you want to address. So for example, healthcare, right? One of the things that I see that is already the rhetoric is that the feds gave us some money. Oh my God, thank God they gave us some money. Oh, Jesus. But I sat up in front of everybody and I was like, listen, honestly, this money is a curse because it's a curse to complacency. Y'all sitting here thinking that this federal money that has all strings attached, okay? Every single dollar has a string attached, seems to be your savior, your lifeboat. But no, we should not be treating that as a lifeboat. We should be focusing on how to build revenue so that we don't come back to this situation again. The feds are not going to keep bailing us out, and they have proven to not bail us out in the past, and they're going to keep on not bailing us out in the future. So you sitting here talking about, oh yes, thank you, feds. Thank you, great gods of feds. But honestly, you should be thinking about how to tax the rich, get every coin out of them that they made during this pandemic. $88 billion of it needs to come back to our communities, needs to fund our schools, fund the healthcare system, and fund the economic structure that's falling apart, that's crumbling right before our very eyes. And so they need to share that wealth. We have 126 billionaires that can afford it. And that's not including the thousandaires and the millionaires that also made some money. Okay. So I sit in that room. I'm like, listen, y'all need to stop playing these games with this federal money here. All right. First of all, y'all need to make sure all that money gets to us. Y'all need to also give up this idea that Jeff Bezos is my friend and think of Jeff Bezos as my sugar daddy. So sugar daddy, cough up, because we've been doing a lot of things, if I may say, because I did hear Greg drop an F-bomb, so I'm gonna drop it. Y'all been fucking for free, okay? Y'all been fucking for free, so y'all need to drop these coins. So sugar daddy Jeff Bezos, thank you. Zuckerberg, thank you for that. And thank you for that in advance. But yeah, I promise I don't curse like this in legislation. I promise. Like in the legislature, I behave.
I'm sorry for cursing.
Sorry for cursing, but it's true though. We've been doing things for free, and it's time to pay the piper. Pay up. And let's have them some respect for ourselves and tell them, give me my coins. Thank you very much.
I officially love listening to you. I need to listen to you all the time. I'm getting all fired up over here. You and I need to hang out sometime. So I'm going to offer something a little bit different. Only because I want to shine some light on how we win or have been winning in Arizona. And if you look back to 2018, and the complacency had been here for a very long time, right? Like it's anti-union stigmatism. It's there's a mindset in the educator world that I need to get out there. And it's what we do is we go into our classrooms and we close the door. And that's a saying in the educator world, because we can control what's behind that door. We can build our community with our students. We can have the love for learning within that. When that door opens, the world oppresses us between our principals, our district, our superintendent, ALEC legislators. We have 41% of our legislators here in Arizona that are ALEC affiliated. And so there's this mindset of, I'm not going to worry about those things because I can just come into my class and close my door. So when we talk about complacency, we have to think of the mindset. And breaking through that mindset here in Arizona was the key to winning, and is still the key to moving us forward in our work. Because what we did through our movement is we said, we need you. We need you to sign up to volunteer with us. We can't do it without you. And when people started to learn facts, political education, basic things like how does our general fund work? Where does funding come from? Arizona's last in the nation for every single education statistic. When people finally had their eyes opened a little bit and consciousness was raised on the issues, they went, oh. And now we have issues that are widely and deeply felt, like funding, which relates to everything: school buildings, ventilation, paychecks, access and opportunity to after school programs. And all of that is tied to oppressive measures, tied to standardized testing that just looks at students as data points that generate funding. And that's it, not human beings that are going to drive this, country forward. And so when we think of complacency, we have to think of mindset. And like being in a right to work state, people had a lot of misconceptions about what does that mean? on simple terms, more broadly about not being forced to pay dues, right? But then down to bargaining and what rights do we have? And when we began to educate folks and they started to realize that these things that they ignored forever, they can no longer ignore, because we made it the number one voting issue here in Arizona for the last 3 years. And we tax the rich. We won in 2019 to tax the rich in Arizona. We won by a 51-49 margin with our ballot initiative, which was progressive taxation on the 1% of income. And it will drive almost $900 million, well, about $827 million annually into our schools. And we did that in Arizona, of all places. So how did we get there? It wasn't by being complacent. It's because we educated folks. We asked them to join us. We had over 2,000 volunteers by the time we were done organizing their workplaces, getting that message out. We worked for 4 weeks on community support and solidarity. And now when you see red shirts here, it's a brand. We have an identity. People trust us. And when we pick up the phone to phone bank people, hey, I'm Rebecca. I'm a teacher. Could I talk to you for a minute? Who's going to hang up on a teacher? Nobody. And if they do, then you're calling the wrong folks anyway. And I can't tell you how important this shirt is here. And the message, we are the messengers. We are the people in our communities that can connect to all the other working class people. I got kids whose parents, work at the post office. They're healthcare workers. They're grocery workers. They work at the gas station. They're bus drivers. They're in logistics. They're, all the strategic industries we have access to. And that's a strategic position for educators. So when we think about complacency, for us, it always starts with, well, what do people think about this thing? And how do we break through that mentality and move people forward? It's about consciousness, because teachers just hide in their classrooms, and that's okay, because that's what we love to do, but we can't do that anymore. And so we had to break through it, and we found ways to do that. And that's why we are one of the most powerful we're a grassroots structure external to the union. We are very much a powerful piece and a powerful mover in this space here because we broke through it.
Yeah, 100%. I wish that this panel could go like all day. I feel like you guys have such incredible insights on, everything that's going on. But we are almost out of time. I did want to ask, just as like one final way to like round us out, if there's, it's related to what we just talked about, but like if there's one piece of advice that you'd want our like fellow organizers to walk away with today as they go back out into the world and start their new campaigns, what would it be? And I'll throw it to Farah.
I spoke about this the other night, but always to bring it back home. When you think of where you are at, to bring it home. You can only be as passionate as what you hold dear. So for me, I know housing, right, is home for me, right? So when I come from an organizing spec, I do it through housing, and that's fine. And I also know that teaching is something that's a home to me. So when I joined the housing movement, I was doing Know Your Rights training. So it wasn't difficult for me to join the movement and make my work meaningful because it was me, right? It was me. And so it didn't feel hard. So I think that once you understand that, once it's personal to you, it just becomes that much easier to jump in. I think sometimes people see others like talking on the microphone or doing this or doing that. Just do you. And I promise you, you will be an asset to the movement.
I can go next. I think like when I talk to young organizers, or I think of like how I started down the path, is like, and it's exactly this. I'm just going to piggyback a little bit. It's like, you have to have passion, right? Like, I'm an educator. This is affecting every aspect of my career, my livelihood, my family, my students. And I have to do the work because I don't have a choice. There's no choice. We have to do this. And if you get into something where you don't have that passion, it's not going to be sustainable. And so like when we do work here, we have little pockets of work and we say, you know, what is your passion? What drives you to be here? Like, which of these buckets are you, like, we have labor committee, we have, you know, membership and talking to folks one-on-one, and people have different skills, and honing in on those skills and who has strengths in certain areas and what are your strengths. My strength is I'm not afraid to talk in public. So I'll gladly be a spokesperson, or really good with organizing with digital tools. I'll gladly take that on. I am not good at reading legislation bills, and I don't like that. So I tend not to do it. But all of those parts and pieces are really important, but it comes back to, you know, I need my passion. Otherwise I'm going to exhaust out, and I'm not going to understand why I continue to do this work and give up hours upon hours every single week to do this work. And so your values mean everything, and you have to hold true to them, like everyone is saying, and finding the space that brings the most joy and brings the most passion, and really your leadership will become better if you have that passion project, really, if you have that passion point to get into the space that you love to be in.
So the only thing I'll add is that during the AIDS epidemic, we organized because our lives depended on it. It's pretty clear last year that our lives depended on organizing. And, you know, for many communities, they didn't need a pandemic to show them that this was the case. So organizing is life-affirming, life-saving, and the life you save may be your own.
Can I just say something about what Rebecca said? When you bring your passion, I also trust you. I trust that this is something that you care about. So when I'm talking to people about tax, when I'm listening to the policy debt and finance group, right, for example, they're talking to me about taxes. I don't have a clue. I really don't. But I know these guys, they love this stuff. They love it. They are deep into it. They put their elbow in, their knee in it. And I'm like, they got it. I trust them. They say 100, they say, the others tell me start at $1 million, but if debt and finance tells me start at 300,000, I'm like, I'm going with these guys because they know what they talk about. So if that, you know, when I talk about health, people believe what I say because I care about it. I read up on it. This is my bread and butter. So if that's what the movement needs. We need people that not only are smart at what they do, but they are trustworthy. Because we ain't getting paid. That's a fact. We volunteer. But to know that you got my back and I got yours, oh, beautiful work. Beautiful work. Mm-hmm. Yes, it's so beautiful.
It's a perfect place to end it. Thank you all for joining us on this panel and for giving us so many awesome words of wisdom and advice during this very difficult time. I really appreciate it. I think everyone here really appreciates it. I think next up is a brief break until 12:45, and then the workshop period will begin again. Thanks for coming, everyone.
Bye, Greg. Bye.
Bye.